Hello friends, my name is Somnath Mukhopadhyay. I did my engineering in electronics and telecommunication from Bengal Engineering College, which is one of the premier institutes in India and which is now known as IIEST. Then I worked for almost 20 years in the software industry, and currently I train people into software. Among my students, there are a lot of kid students, and I'm really proud of my kid students who are doing really well in learning software, and the kids are learning pretty advanced software. I train many students through my training institute, which is known as SOM IT Solutions, and I'm really loving this profession after a long, career in the corporate IT sector. So that today we are going to discuss about one of the most important and most heavily used aspects of Android, that is known as the input event handling. But we will look into the thing not from an user's perspective, but we will try to look into the thing from an inquisitive, ingenious perspective. We'll know how these things happen internally, I mean within the Android framework code. So we will dig into the Android framework code to understand what really happens when an user input event occurs. We will take a case study of a button click event, and we will try to understand exactly what happens when a user clicks a button. We know from a user's perspective, we know from a developer's perspective, we know that whenever a button is clicked, some event occurs, and then actually it calls the callback method or on click, and which basically executes our own code, the developer's own code, which we want the button to do when it is being clicked. But what happens internally? How do these things actually come to the user's area of callback on our own written callback function? How the whole flow goes? That's the thing we are going to discuss today. We'll look into the Android source code, and we'll also, not only that, we will also debug some of the important parts of this Android source code to understand this whole aspect. So let me give you a little background before we start. Whenever an Android application starts, the system creates a main thread, creates a main thread of application. This is also known as the UI thread or user interface thread. All the widgets and all the widgets like buttons and list box and spinners and progress bar, all these things actually run in this context of the UI thread. This is also known as the main thread. There is a class in Android framework that is called activity thread. This is basically responsible for creating all this thread or this thread. Now let me tell you one thing. When you create a thread, or maybe in a Java thread, what happens the moment the run function exits, the thread actually ceases to. Thread also exits from the environment, right? Thread stops, right? The thread stops, and it doesn't, it is not there anymore. Okay, once the run functions is over. But if we want what to do, if we want the thread to run continuously in the background. So the way we do it, actually, we put a infinite loop into the thread's run function, and then if we do that, then the thread actually runs infinitely or continuously in the background. Okay, so this is the technique that has been used in Android framework. Whenever the main thread is run, actually we basically create a class called looper. There is a framework class called looper, and which basically is executed. The loopers loop function is basically executed within the thread's run function. And what the loopers loop function does, the loopers loop function basically creates a infinite loop inside the thread. So what the thread actually does while running in the background infinitely, so it basically waits for some event to occur. The moment there is some event, it basically sends that event to the particular UI widget to handle it. Okay, this is what is known as the event loop. This is also known as the this is known as the event loop, which basically, so what happens actually whenever we create a main application, the event loop is created, and UI threads event loop is created, and this event loop actually waits for any hardware events to occur or any system event, not only in system events, any kinds of event to occur. The moment the event occurs, it basically processes it and then sends it back to the to its handler function. Okay, that's how the whole thing goes. Okay, so we will dig into the source code to understand what I'm trying to say. So let us see the, as I mentioned here, let's have a look at the looper class. So this is the looper class. See, as I told you, looper has a function called looper.loop. This is the looper.loop function. This is the looper.loop function, and then in the looper.loop function, see, this is what it is doing. It is basically running an infinite loop. Okay, that means the thread will run continuously in the background, and then what happens, whenever the message and whenever the looper is created, it also creates a message queue in that thread. Okay, so that message queue, what we actually do, the system actually does, the system, whenever there are hardware events, the system posts the messages to this message queue. So, and then what the looper does, looper actually dispatches this message. See, looper actually dispatches this message to the right target. Okay, to the right target. So this is how the looper works. So this is exactly the basic idea behind the event loop. So even in any kind of UI framework or UI operating system, this design pattern is used. For example, when I started Windows internals, maybe something 18 years back, then also it was like that. Okay, we started the Windows event loop. It is simple like that. Maybe the implementation is a little different, but the principle is same. For any kind of UI framework, the same principle actually applies. Okay, so now let's try to understand what happens when you click a button on the Android. Okay, when you click a button on the Android, I always remember this message is a special class in Android, which is basically used to pass inter-thread communication, inter-process communication, and all sorts of messaging. It can be done using this message framework. Okay, in the message class. Okay, message class object. Okay, here, so whenever you click on a button, this target is actually becomes the UI handler's target, UI message queues handler, and then using that handler, it dispatches the message. Okay, so we will see what happens exactly when the dispatch messages come. So I have defined a so it basically dispatches the message. Okay, so then because target is a handler, then the call goes to the handler class. So in the handler class, what happens? In the handler class, what happens actually? We will see the function call in the handler class. We see the function call dispatch message, right? This is the function it was calling, right? Dispatch message. Okay, this is the function this is the function it was calling from the looper class. This is the function it was calling, right? Message dot handlers. This handler is of course the UI handler. Now if we click on a button on the activity, and then this is the dispatch message. So this is the function that is basically called. Okay, and see, this is the function which basically handles the system messages here. Okay, it basically handles the system messages here. Okay, so what happens when you click on a button on the activity? Ultimately, this function is called, right? This function is called. We will see what is there in the message actually, and we'll try to find out how this thing actually internally happens, and how this thing ultimately calls our handler function, that is the on click function, whatever we have written in the activity. Okay, so this is up to this is clear, right? Whenever a button click happens, ultimately that message we'll understand the message architecture a little later when we will debug the application. So you just remember that whenever the button click is happened, this function will be called, right? Dispatch message will be called, right? And then in dispatch message, this handle callback will be called. Okay, this part will be called, because message dot callback is not equal to null. So this callback is nothing but a runnable. Okay, this message says callback is nothing but a runnable. So what exactly happens whenever this callback is callback? So it basically then callback is not null, then this function will be called. So for any system generated message, ultimately this handle callback message will be called, or it may be this part is also maybe also be called. Okay, but for here we'll see that this function will be called handle callback. Now let's say what the handle callback is doing. So let's first of all let's run this application. Let's run this application. Let's debug this application, and then let's see. Okay, so we will do something like so we'll debug this application. And so whenever, so one thing is clear, whenever I think one thing is clear, whenever the user presses a button on the activity, this dispatch message will ultimately be called, right? So now let's debug this application and try to understand what happens. Okay, what happens internally. So let it start. In the meantime, I can go here. Let's see the handle callback message. So handle callback is we can go to implementation. Handle callback is basically, see, it is basically taking the callback. The callback is, I told you, callback is nothing but a runnable. So it is basically taking the messages callback, that the message is runnable, and it's calling the run method. That means that runnable run method will be called. Now, so our task will be ultimately to find out which callback it calls, right? So for a button click event, which callback it calls to do the task. Okay, that will be our task, right? So let's debug it and let's try to find out that part. Okay, so our callback, again I'm telling you, callback is a runnable which will be called whenever a button click will be whenever a button click happens on the activity. Okay, so our task is to find out which callback it will call. Okay, so let's do that. So let's go to the, again, dispatch message, and let's put a so let me show you the UI. And sorry, let me show you the, we will see something like this is the application that I'm trying to debug with the source code. So let me show it to you. The application is a very simple application. We're just trying to do it, the experimentation. Okay, so square, and then see, this is the simple application. So we'll simply click on the button and then we'll try to find out what happens. Okay, so let's do it here. Let's put a breakpoint here, and let's put a breakpoint here. Okay, and then I have also put a breakpoint in the toe, so that till that part, it stops, till the callback function of the on click is called, it will be stopped there. Okay, then we will try to find out exactly what happens when the button is clicked, what is the callback. So let's go there and let's now click on the button. So I'm clicking on the button. See, so this is now this is a stop here. So what I will do, actually, I will go here, I'll go here and see, this is the callback. See, this is the message that was being called. This is the message that was being called. This is the message that was being called when the button is clicked. And in that message, see, remember, in that message, that callback is the view perform click. Okay, so it is basically calling the view classes perform click runnable. Okay, it is calling the view classes. A perform click will be a class which will be implementing the runnable. It is basically calling that runnable it is calling. So this is the callback that will be executed, right? So let's go to the, so till that this point, I think it's clear, right? whenever we click a event, ultimately that event goes to the calls the view classes perform click, right? View classes and perform click has to be runnable because our callback is runnable. So this basically the perform clicks runs method it calls. Okay, this much is clear. So whenever a button is clicked, ultimately the view classes perform click runnable will runs method will be called, right? So now let's go to the view classes perform click. What happens? Let's see what happens there. Okay, now let's go to the view class. Let's go to the view class and see. This is the perform click. This is the perform click class that will be called ultimately. This run function will be called, right? This run function will be called, and internally perform click internal it will ultimately call. Let's go to this function. Let's go to this function. Go to implementation. It's ultimately called perform click, right? It is ultimately called perform click. So let's go to this perform click function and let's see what happens. So okay, then simply go to and then declaration implementation perform click. See, this is the return perform click. So perform click. So we'll go to the perform click. Let's find out control F perform click. This is the perform click method. This is the perform click, and let's go to the public. This is the function perform click. Okay, this is the function perform click. So now so one thing is clear: whenever a button is pressed, ultimately the view classes this function will be called. Okay, now from here it will be simple the Java event handler design pattern, which is I will event listener design pattern, which I will explain it to you with the Eclipse project, which I have tried to simulate this whole scenario using an Eclipse simple Java project. So one thing should be clear, that whenever a button is pressed on the activity, ultimately this function will be called. Now how this function will be translated to the activities on click method, that is the activities on click method, that part is basically this on click method. That part is basically part of the event listener design pattern, and that design pattern I'm going to teach you using an Eclipse simple project. So remember, this is ultimately in the perform click, it is calling the this on click method. See, this on click method, it is calling on that view. It is calling the on click method on this view. So basically that's how the on click method is called. Now this part, how the whole thing is happening, this on click listener and on click, what is listener and all these things, this is I'm going to explain using my Eclipse project. Okay, so remember, one thing remember, so whenever there is a button click event or button click event occurs in the Android activity, ultimately this part will be executed. Okay, and now let's see how whole thing, this part is being done in the simple fashion in the Java. So from here the event listener design pattern takes over. So and let's try to understand how those things happen. So li is the listener in listener information, and this it is the m on click listener. So button over, basically whenever we are doing the set on click listener, then automatically this button is basically registering for this listener function, and then the buttons on click will be called. So let's try to understand that part. So till that the system part is over, system part is I think you are able to understand that whenever a button click happens, ultimately this function will be called, on click function will be called, right? This on click function will be called. So let's try to understand that design pattern, the event listener design pattern. So from here I will go to the Eclipse and I will try to explain it to you how this event listener pattern actually works. Okay, so let's stop this part. Let's stop this part here, and let's try to understand the so let's stop here, and let's try to understand this part. So we will understand the Eclipse part. Okay, that the event listener design pattern. So let's open the Eclipse and let's understand how the whole flow goes. Okay, so what we are going to do actually, we are going to dig into the event listener pattern that has been implemented into any many of the Java framework, and this is a specific design pattern. This is very similar to the observer design pattern or callback design pattern, and this is exactly I'm going to explain it to you now. Okay, the event listener design pattern. I have tried to simulate the whole thing, like the whole Android thing here using this pattern, and I hope you will be able to understand it pretty nicely. So one thing I would like to repeat it: whenever a button click event occurs, ultimately the view Android framework view classes perform click will be called, and this from this perform click the event listener design pattern takes over, and it basically ultimately calls the that views on click method. Okay, that activities on click method where that view has you know has the views on click method that has been implemented by users, by us. Okay, by the developers. Okay, so let's try to understand that event listener design pattern from a simple perspective now. So we will do something. So here what happens here is similar to the view class of the Android. I have done a view class here. Similar to the view class of the Android, I have done a view class here, and let me explain it to you. Let it build. This is Java tooling. Let it build first. Build the workspace, and then it is taking more time than usual. Let us wait. Okay, Java tooling, and I think it's done. Over. Okay, so now let's experimentation with simulation under button click event. This is the project which we will look into, and this is the different classes. So see, the view class I have defined is just like Android view class, not exactly Android, it's a simpler function. So what we have, similar to the Android view class, we have a listener info class. In this listener info, whatever listeners are basically interested in events that are being put one by one. So here I put just two listeners: on click listener and on long click listener. What are these listeners? The listeners are nothing but interfaces with a single function. Okay, the listeners are nothing but interfaces with a single function. So let's go it. So see, on click listener, public interface on click listener having a single function called on click, and on long click listener having a single function called on long click. So you have in the listener info class, you have both are being mentioned here. And then I have done a lazy initialization where basically I have created a member variable called listener info, and because I came from a C++ background, so this aim and all these things are coming into the picture. This is the C++ nomenclature, so please excuse me for that. And then this listener info, I have done a lazy initialization, and then whenever basically this is the same listener info, it returns again and again whenever somebody wants the listener info class object from this view class. Okay, then what is this part? This part is public for perform click. What it is the click function. What I'm do, this is the like Android view classes perform click. In the perform click, like there we have called the on click function. Similarly here we have from the listener info dot click listener dot on click. These are similar to the Android function. Okay, and then in the set on click listener, we have simply put the set on click listener like this. Okay, so this is exactly how the whole thing is done. So the set on click listener and this is the set on click listener. So let's try to understand how this thing is done in activity. In the activity, I have created a button. So what is the button class? Let me show a button class. This button class is basically extends view, and these are very simple function. Okay, in the activity class, like the Android, I have a button, and then I have created the button in the activities constructor, and then I have put a set on click listener, just like we do in the Android application code. Okay, then what happens on the on click method, just like we do in the Android, I have created my own version of the handler function for the button clicker. Then what happens, then whenever this, and this of course implements view.onClick listener, just like the Android activity code. Okay, and then in the main class, what I have done an activity, a new activity, and then I have called the perform click. So remember, whenever you are going to click a button, ultimately this view classes perform click will be called, right? As here I have done this similar thing. The view classes perform click is called. So think that somebody has clicked a UI code on this command line interface, and then this view.perform click has been. Whenever this view.perform click will be killed, then it will be clicked, then automatically this code will be called. Okay, this is how the whole event listener pattern has been done in Android. This is very similar to the observer pattern. Actually, this is the observer pattern. Okay, but this is very similar to this. So let's try to understand this. Let's run it. Okay, so let's run it and let's see what happens. So if we run it, simply, if we run it here, it has gone for the toss. So what do we do actually? So what I will do is we run the main class and let's see what happens. Okay, see, you click me automatically. Whenever you are calling perform click, the on click function of the button that is there, we have defined there, the on click method is being called. You clicked me, right, and you clicked me. Okay, so this is how the whole flow goes. Okay, so remember, whenever we click a button, so let me repeat it once again. So whenever you click a button on the activity, ultimately with all the messages and all these things, ultimately what happens, it calls the views on perform click method. These views, from there, it basically the event listener pattern, design pattern takes care of the whole thing, and then ultimately that button's on click method, that activities on click method will be called, and then on click callback method will be called, and in that on click callback method will basically do the buttons part. Okay, so this is little bit complicated, but I hope I was able to throw some light what happens internally when a button is clicked on the Android screen. And this is very important, one of the most important and heavily used, the most used part of any mobile framework, not only any mobile framework, for any UI oriented software OS. Okay, thank you for listening to my lecture. Bye.